behalf of Nigerian Chapter of Society for Conservation Biology, on behalf of our Safe Sahara Network that is collaborating and partner on this webinar, I welcome everybody, and I want you to prepare your question and answer. You can raise your hand after the presentation. You can also send your question to the chat, which we're going to read after the presentation. And we want to make sure that you mute yourself as much as possible.
So welcome everyone to the first session of, as Dr. Bobolov told us, this is on scholarly publishing and writing. And we're very, very excited. We have an elite presentation today by a good friend of ours who's actually, I believe, visited Nigeria and has seen the country in live. So she has been to Nigeria and understands a little bit about it, which is great. I'd like to introduce Dr. Tuyeni Mwampamba, who I believe is originally from Kenya, but she now resides in Mexico. She is a research professor at the Institute for Ecosystems and Sustainability at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. And she's been there about 10 years. She first went to Mexico for a postdoc, and she has made her home there. And she is very active at the Institute for Ecosystems and Sustainability Research. She leads a research group on ecology and social implications of community forest management. And they look at trying to understand the social and ecological dynamics of managing forests in tropical areas. And they are particularly interested in how sustainability is conceptualized by different actors and stakeholders and how it manifests in both policy and practice. She actually has spent time studying charcoal production systems in Mexico and East Africa. And she's involved with both students and other colleagues in this research. And she also studies more generally natural resource management using participatory processes and looking at both traditional knowledge and scientific knowledge to build bridges across sectors and conservation actors. She is well published. She's also a section editor for Case Studies for the Environment. We're very welcome to have Dr. Mwampamba today. And so please, just a reminder, if you go ahead and mute yourselves, and probably you might want to turn off video just to kind of, if the network is slow, that might help the presentation. So we welcome all of you today. Thank you for joining us. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Tuyeni.
Thank you so much, Fola. Thank you so much, Lynn, for this invitation. Thank you, Lynn, for a very generous introduction. Thank you all for being here and for your interest in this webinar. I immediately accepted the invitation to be part of this. We just need a lot more research or a lot more articles from African researchers. We know you're out there doing the work, and we would like to see it a lot more in journals. And I understand and I know that it's not easy, it's difficult, it's a struggle we all have. And the idea behind my talk in particular today is to highlight some of the main things that you should be thinking about when it comes to publishing your work. And the two things that I focus on, because we have limited time, is making sure that there's something novel, new, interesting about your work, and just trying to discover what that is before you start writing. And then I will introduce to you what's called the OCAR approach, or structure for writing a paper, which I have found extremely useful as a tool and a way to undertake the process of writing. So just a little correction, I'm actually from Tanzania. It's close enough. The Kenyans are neighbors. And indeed, yes, I've been living in Mexico now for 10 years. And I was in Nigeria a couple of years ago, spending most of it up in Bauchi State, in Yankari, working with Dr. Salamatu Fala. So I will start by making a few assumptions about who you are, so that I can continue with the talk under the premise that these are that hopefully these assumptions are right, and if they're not, then you have to adjust what I say so that it actually fits your own reality. I'm trying to change slides, but it's not working. Okay, so here we go. My assumptions about you are this. So this is the assumption that I'm making about you, that you're either early to mid-career level, and as Fola had mentioned, that you need to publish as part of your job description. You conduct research, you generate data, you have your data somewhere, and the topic is environmental conservation related topic, and you're interested at this point in your career to be communicating your findings to a broader audience in written form, beyond your own colleagues and beyond your usual way of communicating your research. For this particular talk, it's important to note that I am assuming you're interested in a original research paper, so not a review, not a paper on the state of the art, or not an opinion piece, which are other types of articles that are published in journals. I'm also assuming that you read a lot of articles. You are familiar with the basic structure of a research article and all the different components that a typical article contains. And there is a, pardon me, a lag period in. Okay. So the typical structure of a paper is what they call the IMRAD structure, which is the introduction, the materials and methods, results, and then the discussion. And the discussion might contain within, usually contains within the conclusions. And this structure is extremely useful for presenting papers. And we're all, as people who read scientific papers, we are accustomed to it. It's very useful to know what to expect and not to have to adjust yourself to a different structure each time. So it's a shared way in which scientists present information. But when it comes to writing a paper, it's not really the way that papers are written. It gives the assumption, it's a very neat structure. It gives the assumption that we start off with very tidy ideas of what we're going to do and what belongs where. But the writing process is a lot messier. It's very iterative, and you go through writing and rewriting several times, and you don't necessarily start in this order. Okay, so as I continue through this presentation, I'd like to identify the two sources of inspiration that I have used. I find them extremely useful when using them, for instance, with my own students, that on how to write scientific papers. The book in particular by Joshua Schimmel is extremely an extremely useful resource. It goes through a very it really does a good job of letting you know what a paper should try to achieve and how. It has wonderful examples, and I go back to it over and over again. And then the work by Professor Jörn Fischer from the University of Leuphana in Germany, where he writes extremely well and then has a blog, which I've put down there as a link, on that gives tips from how to frame your paper all the way to the letter to the chief editor. That's really useful. And what I also like about what he provides is sort of formulas. If you're really struggling and can't put the first sentence down, then he helps you with these formulas of, okay, write this, and then this, and then this. And I'll show an example of that a little further on. So sorry, there's a bit of a lag period when I turn my slides. So this is a 1-hour session. We have even less than 50 minutes left, and there is absolutely no way that I'm going to be able to tell you everything there is about writing a scientific paper. You're not going to walk out of this or leave this webinar with the ability to write a paper. But in case, there's a few messages here that I wanted to leave, because that's really what you should be taking out of it, is that in order to be able to write, you really have to also be reading a lot of papers in your field, and reading consistently in order to have a really good sense of what's going on in your field, what is the discourse, what are the interesting and new things that are happening in your field. But as you read also those papers in your field, also try to look for the style of writing that speaks best to you, that resonates best to you, because that's probably the style that you find also the most natural for you. You want to choose a style that's easiest for you rather than one that you're struggling with the whole time. I strongly advise that if you're going to write a paper, to either join a writing group, and if there isn't one, to form one. You actually have to write if you're going to write, which means you have to give yourself the time. You have to carve out in your schedule the hours that are needed to focus on writing. Writing is a creative process. It requires you to zone out everything else, all the noise, the baby crying, the construction outside, the emails popping in. All those things have to be muted in order to get into the depth of thinking and creativity that is needed to write. Make sure you get feedback from experienced peers before you send your work out. Take whatever critique you get seriously, take it to heart. It's a great way to improve. Nobody writes perfectly the first time, nor the second, nor the third. And don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. So at some point you have to send it off either to that peer, to that you have to submit it finally to the journal. You can't just hoard it and try to perfect it. So in case internet goes off and we don't get to the end, these are key messages that I would like you to take home with you and work on them. So the very first thing that I would like to share with you is that I think one of the things that's really has affects science is that we don't think of it, especially scientific writing, as storytelling. The papers we read, the article is actually a story. And we are storytellers. The humans, society, cultures have passed on information and knowledge over time through stories. Stories are extremely powerful. They evoke emotions in us. And in order for a story to be good, it must be interesting. Its content, must be something we want to hear, something we want to learn about. The content can be interesting, but you also have to be able to tell it well. So a lot about the story is in how it's told, both in how you structure it, but also what language you use. And it is the well-told, interesting stories that are retold. And we often forget that, the retelling part, that a story that is told but then never retold is a dead story. And you should always aim to tell a story that will be repeated, because then that is how whatever knowledge and interesting things that you wanted to say get transferred over to the next person. So as Fola had mentioned earlier, that we are all very much under this pressure to publish or perish. Publish or perish is very much about how many papers you have, making sure your paper is out there, that you've communicated your work. And but Joshua Schimmel, in the book that I mentioned to you earlier, he says, well, publish or perish is really just about surviving in science. It's not really about succeeding. And what he means by that is that as scientists, it's not enough just to have ideas and hold those ideas in our heads and have great thoughts. It's not even enough to go out there and collect the data and have this amazing data in our hands. In the end, it's how we bring that data and those ideas together to be able to describe them in a way that's compelling, coherent. And so to succeed as a scientist, you shouldn't just think about getting published, you should think about getting cited, because citations are what let you know that your peers have understood your work, and they haven't only understood it, but they're using it to motivate their own work. This is where you truly have impact. And oftentimes we forget this. When we start writing our paper, we're thinking more about finishing the paper, getting it out there, and we're not so much focusing on making sure that we presented things that will be cited, presented material that will be cited. So the objective of writing and publishing should really be about getting cited. And because when you're cited, your work is recognized. And in order to be cited, you must tell a story that's worth hearing. So this is where the novelty comes in, and the novelty is about your content. So that material that you've collected, you've brought it together, and now it's your content, and it's telling us something, and we want to hear that story, but you have to convince us that it's a story that's worth hearing. And then you must captivate your audience. So you must be able to communicate that interesting, compelling, that story or that information. And the way you do it, of course, in a scientific paper is through your writing. And writing, on the one hand, has to do with structure, so how you're organizing your ideas and how the flow of the paper goes, but also about language, your choice of words, how you phrase and express yourself, making sure that's compelling and captivating throughout. Your job is to captivate your audience in all sections of your paper, and not just the introduction, not just the conclusions. In a journal article, you also have visual aids, figures and diagrams and tables that are part of the way you communicate, and they too can be extremely powerful. Sometimes the only thing we remember about a paper is the way they presented their data and what that data then said or was able to, what new knowledge it was able to communicate. So a big part, and the first part of writing a paper is going to be about finding your story. What is going to be the novel, interesting thing that you're going to share with the community in the field of research that you do? And novelty has to do, yes, the new knowledge, the new understanding that you're offering. And it reminds us that oftentimes we think of our data as sort of the novel, new, interesting thing to share. But it's important to remember that collecting data and having data is really just the very first step in science. Science is about generating knowledge, new knowledge, using that knowledge to create and develop understanding, and with that understanding, we can then have wisdom, or we can apply this understanding to future scenarios if we're able to describe our system and its processes well. So this flow of this path is a path that we usually take. So we have our data, we organize it so that it provides information. We organize it, analyze it, provide information. This information, we start looking for patterns, and these patterns tell us something about the system or the phenomena that we are trying to understand or studying. And when we have different types of information about the system and different ideas of how it's operating, we can then say some really meaningful things about the system, whether it's working in an expected way, whether it's there are unexpected aspects or attributes of the system, which then create this curiosity and new knowledge and desire to get to know more about the system. And so you sort of generate the new research questions. That's the way science works. And when you're writing a paper, what you're trying to do is demonstrate the new knowledge you're bringing or the new understanding. That it's not about the data, it's not about the information. And we oftentimes forget that, because the data and the information have been sort of where most of our effort and energy and maybe even our resources have gone into. So we sometimes lose sight of what exactly it is that we should be doing in a paper. And so the very first task you have before you put pen to paper and start writing your article is really identifying what are the key findings of your work. And so that means you're not really able to start writing your paper until you have your data, you've cleaned it, you've analyzed it, you've got your graphs and tables and everything before you, and now you're starting to look, okay, what is all this information telling me? You can't tell it all. So you have to decide which are the 2 to 3 key findings that are here and focus on those for the paper that you'll be writing now. If there are lots of key findings, then you should separate them so that perhaps several papers can come out of the same set of data. And how do you know it's a key finding? Well, it's because you are also reading a lot about your field, and so you know what is known and unknown, what's not yet well understood, and so you can link this information that's coming out of your work to those gaps in knowledge or extension of an idea and so forth. So the very, very first thing you should do, and you should do this as soon as you feel that you have your results and your analysis done, is jot down what are the 2 to 3 key findings, and then why are these key findings. And you should provide references to previous work that tell you this is important because so-and-so said this is something we don't understand enough of. This is important because we know it for this species, but not for that, or for this system and not for that. This is important because it suddenly gives us insight to how, if you do it in another place, then the results or the system operates differently. And here, I'm not going to go through them, are just some examples of key result and how you would write it down, it's still very much in a bullet point way. It doesn't necessarily have to be complete sentences. And the first part tells you what the findings are, and then the red text is saying, okay, but what does this mean? What does this actually mean? So it means this landscape is non-homogeneous, and that means there will be variations in how it behaves. And then I put some citations of, okay, who said this? Well, the literature that talked about land legacy and so forth. And the second example is very similar. The first part is about what are the exact results from my own research, but then what does it mean in red? What is that, what's sort of the new information that I'm bringing to the table, and what are its implications? So then the second task is deciding, of all the data that you have, which is the one you should present. And as you discover what your key findings are, you realize that it doesn't take all the data to build that story, to tell, to be able to talk about those findings. So this is a really difficult moment, because we know how long and how tedious and how laborious it was to develop our data. We feel bad about removing any data, eliminating data, omitting data. And so, but it's important to remember that the process that you underwent to develop the data, to generate it, to analyze it, was part of a personal journey that you had to take to get to these findings. So it's never wasted. So remember that some of the data can just distract from the main story, which you definitely don't want to do. Some of the data can be collapsed. So perhaps you have very, very detailed data, but you don't need that level of detail to be able to tell the story. And you can always save the unused data for other purposes. There is supplementary material that you can include it in for people later on to be able to do meta-analysis, or it can be used to tell a whole nother story in another paper. And then the third task is developing your visual aids in terms of what are the figures and tables and graphs and diagrams that you're going to use to be able to present that data in a way that's easy to understand, self-explanatory, powerful. Remembering that, a picture paints 1,000 words. You can save a lot of text and words if you have an effective diagram or table. It's important to keep diagrams and tables simple, self-explanatory. You don't want too simple, and to focus on the effectiveness of that diagram or table or figure or whatever, without losing the rigor of the data. So you still want to demonstrate that this information is coming from the field, it's coming from actual data. This is not fiction. It's data-driven figures and tables. There are increasingly the figures and tables of papers are becoming a lot more artistic, visually pleasant. A lot of people get graphic designers to help them with the design of their figures. All that still shouldn't take to convey with these visual aids. And there's lots of resources on how to do this, and I give a bunch of resources, web pages that you can go to that advise you should be using a figure, should be using a table, when to and when not to, and when is it, what kind of figures are most effective at communicating different types of messages. here are just examples. You should definitely at some point think whether, if you have long lists, lots of information that can be categorized, then the way to go is a table. Consider combining several results to tell one singular story. So with panel type of figures, maps can be very powerful for telling you, for demonstrating the geographical distribution, especially if you complement them with actual data beneath them. So there's so many ways to communicate, and it's important to look at different papers to see how they're doing that. But once you have that, you have your story, you know what your key findings are, and this is what the story will be about. This is the content. This is the actual facts that you'll be sharing with the world. You know which data you'll be using to tell the story and how you'll be presenting the story. Then you're ready to write. Then you're ready to write the rest of the article, and that's sort of the step two. When you go to a writing workshop, usually you already have those key findings identified, the results done. It's terrible to start writing a paper and still not have your results figured out, still be analyzing your data. You're actually not ready to start writing an introduction, for instance, if you haven't yet got to the point where you are very clear about what's the new information that you're contributing and presenting to the community. So this is where this OCAR story structure comes in that I mentioned earlier. And what does OCAR stand for? Well, O is the opening, C is the challenge, A is the action, R is the resolution. These are the elements that any story has, not just an article. So if you think of a story, it has characters. Those characters do something. They usually have a challenge. Something happens that they have to resolve. A lot of stories about how they go about resolving that problem and all the different things that happen in between. And then in the end, there is how, having gone through all that process, something has changed in the characters or in the situation. You go through that very same set of a very similar process when writing a scientific paper. So rather than who is the story is about, you're trying to understand what is this larger problem that you're addressing, where is this story taking place, what do you need to understand about the situation in order to follow the rest of the story. So that's sort of the background. Then you end this initial part of your paper with the challenge. So what is it that you specifically are trying to answer, resolve, expand on, etc.? What is the purpose that of what you're about to tell a story about? And this is similar to what is it that the characters, and in any other story it might be what do the characters need to accomplish, and then it's about the action. Then after that follows the action. So what happens to address the challenge? So what did you do? What did you find? This is the materials and methods. It also is about the interpretation of your data and the results. And then you end, and it's really important to make sure that as you end, your reader has a sense of, I have learned something. This has given me a new insight, or this shift, both in what we knew at the beginning and what to know at the end, needs to happen with your reader. And you do that by making it very explicit what you are supposed to have learned from your work. And that is your conclusion. So if you can, you're probably already seeing this, that if you map this opening, challenge, action, resolution on your typical introduction, materials and methods, results, structure, then your opening is your introduction. You introduce all your characters. You start broad and you end narrow. You finish your introduction with your questions, your specific questions that you ask, your hypothesis. You get into the action through your materials and methods, your results, so what you did and what you found, what it all means. This is still part of the action. You're trying to still tell the story. And then as a result of knowing what it all means, you end with your resolution, which are basically your take-home messages or your conclusions. And this hourglass structure from, and Schimmel talks a lot about it in his paper on writing science, is really important to keep in mind. You do want to start, you notice the opening starts broad, goes narrow, and then when you get into the discussion, you start narrow and you end broad. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but you do want to maintain a balanced beginning and end. And so I won't repeat this because it's exactly what I said, but this is just mapped again against your typical structure of a paper. And now go very, very quickly through what all these different sections of the paper are supposed to do. This is still talking about the structure, but having a good sense of your structure and what story and how you're going to build your story is important, bearing in mind that you already know what's a novel contribution that you're making. And the novel contribution, we're not talking about shifting paradigms. We're just talking about you're providing something that we didn't know about. And now you're trying to frame it so that your readers can appreciate that they need to continue reading and that this is an interest, they're going to learn something after having finished reading your paper. So the introduction is where you start with an opening paragraphs that are very general. You get into some background, and remember, you finish off with your challenge, your specific questions. And it really is your way of opening your audience, your reader, to what you're about to present them. It's a very powerful position, and you shouldn't muck it up. I think people just don't spend enough time on the opening. A lot of papers that you read now are very mundane platitudes. I don't know how many times we're hearing it's an unprecedented moment. You need to try to avoid this because this is your opportunity to capture an audience and to really convince them that it's worth reading the rest of the paper. You don't want to lose your audience in the very first paragraph. And so what should you be doing? Opening, you should really, by the time your reader has read what is the story about, where does it take place? Is this just about Nigeria? Is it a certain part of Nigeria? This is West Africa. Where is the geographic space that this work is taking place, or that this what do you need to understand to follow this story? What's some of that? How do you convince me that this is something that is worth hearing, a story worth hearing? And how does this particular story set into a larger problem? Because maybe I'm not so interested in what really captures me about your work is more the larger problem, the fact that you're contributing the larger problem, and not so much the details. So you have to give me a sense of, or any reader, a sense of, what is a larger problem beyond Nigeria, beyond your study site, that is connecting us and making me want to read your paper? Now, here is a first paragraph in a paper. I can't remember which paper it is, but the things, the words that I have highlighted there do allow you to get all that information. I think this is a very powerful opening paragraph. It tells me immediately that it's about tropical forests. about biomass productivity, and that it's going to focus in Amazonia, and that whatever it is that they're going to talk about, it has global consequences. So the magnitude of the problem is global. Then they go on and they say that changes in climate. So the main problem here is that the climate is going to change, and this has consequences for these forest communities. And then they specify which particular attributes of climate change are the ones that we should be worrying about, and then which particular aspect or attribute of tropical forests they will be focusing on. And here's a big sentence, and this is why I should worry, and it's a way of drawing you into the story and making sure you share the concern. This is what could happen if we don't understand all this, and if we don't have a good grasp of what's happening. We could eventually compromise forest biomass and productivity. And then they give some sort of hypothesis that things could happen. You can see the language they're using. Seasons might threaten, and so they're starting to demonstrate that we're not exactly sure about what happens. And then they tell you exactly what they hope to do and what their objectives were. They want to understand how Amazonian trees, so we went from tropical forests now to Amazonian trees, how they've responded for the last 30 years to environmental changes. And then they even tell you how they do it. They analyze floristic records. This is a very coherent introduction, opening, just the first paragraph. Here's another one that is also the first paragraph of a paper, and it doesn't have the same effect as the other one. I will let you read it yourself later. We will share the slides. But I finished reading that first chapter, and I'm not sure what this paper is going to be about. And I'm confused. I'm then unsure if I really want to continue reading it, and if it's really what I was expecting given what I had seen in the title or the abstract. And you don't want to do that. You don't want to stop your reader from continuing to read the rest of the paper. Your job is to keep them moving from paragraph to paragraph, making sure that you're offering a journey that is worth taking, and they want to take it with you from not just paragraph to paragraph, but sentence to sentence. But we won't, there's no way I'm going to be able to get into paragraph structure and sentence structure in this talk. The one thing that you need to remember when you're writing, and especially your opening paragraph, is that this is what you're promising to your reader. You have to be able to keep this promise as you go through the process of writing your paper. You have to end, so the bottom of the funnel, of this hourglass, sorry, has to meet, the reader has to feel that you have fulfilled your promise. You promised them X, Y, and Z in the opening. You've delivered by going back to what you had promised and delivering it at the same level. So by that I mean that if you are starting by saying that you are presenting a problem that's global, but then you end up showing through your data and what you're able to conclude being to say something only very specific about your area, then you run the risk that readers will feel cheated. So you said, you talked about tropical forests, but in the end you actually just talked about one species in Yankari Forest Reserve. You overpromised. You want to aim for the B, where the scale and the level and that you promise is what your data is able to deliver, and what you the conclusions that you're able to make. You can also under deliver or under promise. So you might have, you start off very specific and very, very narrow in your focus. But based on the data you've developed and the findings that you have, you can actually tell a much larger story that's relevant to a much larger geographical area or a larger component of the system. And the risk of not being able to match your opening with your resolution is that, and especially going from narrow to wide, is that you lose your audience. They're then not sure what they're supposed to get from it, and they have to end up making their own conclusions, and that runs the risk of them understanding your work. Okay, so you end your introduction with the challenge. The challenge is really, really easy to write because it's your research questions, your specific questions that you had, but you restructure them so they have to do with the findings. So you might have had lots of research questions, but the specific ones that you will mention here as you finish off your introduction are the ones that that best take you to your key findings. And that often means that you might have to rethink your research questions, which sounds sometimes counterintuitive or counter to what we're told we're supposed to do in science. We're supposed to have research questions where go out and collect the data. The research questions doesn't change after you analyze your data. Well, you can adapt your research questions so that they're better suited for the findings that you have. This is also where you describe your hypothesis, if you had any. But I just wanted to mention that between the opening and the challenge, there's all this space. So the opening is that first paragraph, and then the challenge are your specific questions, and so what happens in between. So between the opening paragraph, there's usually 3, 4, 5 additional paragraphs. And what do? They extend the introduction of the general problem you're addressing. They present your arguments, you develop them there, and you justify why it's necessary to understand this problem. They highlight existing knowledge gaps. What do we know? What don't we know about this topic? And what are the implications of not knowing? That's really important to be able to communicate, because this is when you're generating curiosities. Like, if we don't know this, this could happen. And then you start presenting your hypothesis, and you're conveying that this is a problem worth studying. And then you provide this background information in order that people then can understand later on, when you get into your discussion and when you present your results, they have this they're on the same page as you to be able to interpret your results also in the same way. So in a really good introduction, by the time your readers get to the challenge, your specific questions, they should actually be quite obvious, because you have done a really good job of carrying them through this process of making them realize that if this is a problem, then these are the questions you should be asking. An introduction is inadequate if it doesn't really define a concrete problem. If it assumes that everyone already knows a problem. Sorry, I have some, I've used these to give a talk, to do workshops in Spanish. So some of the words are actually Spanish. Sorry about that. An introduction, if it caters to a very narrow audience, you run the risk of losing many other people who might be interested in your work, but you haven't written for them. It's also not a very good introduction if you simply justify your work by saying, well, we just don't know enough about this topic. You need to be able to convey why it's important to know anything about this topic. Hasn't this topic been sufficiently studied? What don't we know about it? That needs to be conveyed in introduction. And if it doesn't, then you just lose the audience. And it's also not a very good introduction if you end with, well, our objectives were to carry out a study. No, your objective was not to carry out a study. Your objective was to to understand something, to develop new knowledge. And it's important to focus on the knowledge and findings and understanding that your work does, and not the actions that you did and the data that you collected. Here's an example. I won't go through it, but later on, as you go through the slides, you can look at an example of an introduction that fails to provide, that just offers a solution without really defining a problem. And there are many other ones. If you look into Schimmel's book, for instance, he provides both good and bad examples. The other thing to watch out with an introduction, and it happens often, is that instead of really writing an introduction, we write a literature review. And sorry again for the spelling mistake here. There is a really subtle difference between an introduction and a literature review. They both use existing literature to talk about what we currently know and to present what is currently known about the particular topic. But while a literature review, you can think of it as building a solid wall of what is known. So brick upon brick, paper upon background information that tells you this in the end is what we know about this topic. An introduction, a good introduction, or what it should do instead is focus on the gaps in the wall. This is what we don't know. And this is why what I'm doing is important, because it helps us fill these gaps. So it's really important when you're reading literature to look and see where people mention, okay, this is, we still don't know this, we still don't know that. And in most papers, you'll find that actually towards the discussion, when people talk about what still needs to be known. All right. And there are little tricks that you can, when you analyze your own work, you can see, okay, am I writing an introduction, or am I writing a literature review? If you don't really talk about knowledge gaps, then you're probably writing a literature review. If you find yourself placing citations at the beginning rather than at the end of the sentence. So you're saying Mwampamba discovered that bees make honey, which focuses on Mwampamba, and it's probably telling some kind of history. And so you're saying what's out there, what's the information out there, and who are the different people that contribute to the information, versus bees make honey, which is just a fact, and you're attributing Mwampamba's work to that fact. So if you find yourself doing a lot of so-and-so said this, so-and-so said that, and then so-and-so discovered this, and then it's really a literature review. You're building a wall, and you're not working towards showing what is not known. And if you find yourself citing a lot of facts, but you don't actually provide your own reflection about it, so you're not doing any synthesis, you're just piling the information on. So brick after brick of information, but not really saying, what does this information tell us? When you compile it all together, what do we learn about, what insight does all this information give? Just little hints, and they must be. I'll look at my work. And Jörn Fischer, which another resource that I use, actually provides a formula, so to speak, of how to write an introduction. It has all the elements that I mentioned of the intro, background, challenge, etc. But if you're writing your paper for the very first time, it's a very, very useful formula to use that helps you make sure you have everything that an introduction needs. And then as you do this often enough, it becomes much easier to do it a little bit differently from this formula. So I just put it out there for you to look at and try it, especially if you're stuck and you just can't get the first sentence out there, and then say, okay, let me just do this. and then at least I will have the main structure of my introduction done. So after the introduction, we get into the action, no? The materials and the methods. And this really, everyone will tell you, is the easiest section to write because it's just about describing what you did. All you have to remember that the objective of this section is that you're trying to describe everything that the reader needs to know in order to be able to replicate what you did and to get a really good sense of what are the different decisions that you made, where did they take place, what is the context. So when it comes to the results, they can assess whether it's possible to get to these results given what you did. So it's a way also to be very transparent about how you obtained your data and how you analyze that data. That means you need to describe all the procedures in sufficient detail, not too much detail. The method is usually written in past tense. And the only proceed, and you need to, it all depends on your discipline and the journal that you're writing in. You may not need to describe every procedure, and especially when it's well known, then you just might cite it. And then there are some tips. Sometimes you have a lot of methods, so you might think of actually creating subheadings for each type of data that you collected, or you can you need to assume that your audience also has a certain background knowledge. So there's some things that you don't have to describe everything to them, and you have to identify what is the parts of your methods that need further explanation, and those are the ones that you expand on. And this takes us to the topic of reproducibility. And this is really, it's getting more and more important. I don't know how many of you might have experienced what I have experienced oftentimes is you find a really good study, you really like it, you want to repeat it in your own study area, and you realize that if you just read the methods and materials, you actually cannot repeat it because they don't provide enough information. That's very frustrating because it also then means you start realizing just how much has not been told of the materials and methods, which then cast doubt of whether it's possible to come up with the same results if you repeat the study. There's a lot of talk now about reproducibility, and I have provided a resource at the end of the slides for you to look at, which really gives you a sense of what it's about, why you should try to achieve it, and why it should really be a minimum standard that we all abide to. And yeah, here is actually the information. And then still part of the actions are the results, but they're done. Remember, because you already did that at the very beginning. So this is about bringing them now into the results section, bringing those graphs in, confirming that your storyline is what is appropriate for the results you're about to present, that you are going to present in the paper. So this is great because with the way a paper is written, there is a style for writing results, but that's I'm not going to go into it. It's very important to remember that results can still and should be written as a story. Oftentimes the results section can be extremely boring to read because the author forgets that they still need to be able to capture the reader's attention. It's also a very technical part, so oftentimes think, well, you're just interested in the technical. Well, to really remember results, you have to be able to convey them in an interesting way. And that's, I won't get into it, but to remind people that the storytelling doesn't end when you get to the results section. This is the hardest. It can be difficult to write the results in an interesting way, but the papers that we remember are the ones that do. What does it all mean? You have already also done that at the very beginning in your key findings as you link them to what does this mean for the bigger problem? What does it mean for the questions I was asking? How does this help me understand the system or the species or the topic that I'm studying? And the discussion is really where you're beginning to close the loop. You're presenting your thoughts, your interpretation of the data, you're answering your questions, the ones that you posed in the challenge. Then you're showing how this is contributing to the larger problem that you framed in the opening. You're really closing and finishing up, wrapping up. And it should be a story of its own. It's dangerous results and make for an effective discussion. There are lots of different ways you can structure. You actually have quite a bit of flexibility, and I'll just point out here. You can start by reiterating the problem, and so you're re-energizing the curiosity in your reader. You demonstrate how you answer the question, what that means in terms of solving that big problem, that big general problem. Another option, you can say, okay, I'm going to start a specific challenge. I said that I had these specific questions. I show, okay, I have 3 main findings. You discuss each finding independently, and then you conclude by saying, what does this mean then for the broader problem? Or you can start by identifying, what does this paper really contribute to the broader problem? How my results show that? And what are the new and interesting additional questions that emerge from this work? So these are 3 options, for instance, for how to write your discussion. And then finally, the conclusion. And a good conclusion, resolution, really gives you the sense that the story is coming to an end. I have learned something, the knowledge or information, there's new insights, something has advanced. I am not where I was at the beginning. As a result of having undertaken this journey, I'm in a different place. That's important. We often forget and we underestimate the importance of the conclusion. And what it does is basically the OCAR backwards. So you reiterate the action, you answer the questions that you raise in the challenge, and then you demonstrate how these answers contribute to the larger problem. That's a really nice way to end. It's dangerous to start opening up other topics in the conclusion, or to end with a platitude, well, this is important or interesting, has policy implications. It's tempting to end that way, but it can kill the excitement that you might have initiated with when you end up with platitudes. And this is where I would really like to end by reminding again that what you're trying to do as you write a paper is present something that gets citable, that gets used, that inspires others. That on the one hand, you shouldn't be starting to write before you know what is the story that you want to tell and why it is that it's worth hearing. And that means a really good grasp of your field and what's happening in that field. And so reading a lot of scientific articles, academic papers in your field. A big part of then how you tell that story is about captivating, and you do that through structure. And I focused mostly on structure here, and how you organize those ideas. I haven't said anything about language, and I will not. It's a whole other talk, to be honest. And then you also are going to be using visual aids. You're going to maximize on your figures and diagrams and tables, of which you have a limited amount in a paper. You can't put as many as you like. And making sure that those complement and amplify your story. And that in the end, the internal structure of a paper, and sorry for this terrible, very blurry diagram here, but if you were to go into the internal structure of the paper, you would have the big arc that says paper as sort of the overarching experience that you want a reader to go through. And that's subdivided into these sections, and these sections are already given to us. They are the introduction, the material methods, etc. In an article, in a scientific article, we already have it. But then you start taking control of those paragraphs, and those paragraphs, each paragraph also is a story, and it builds upon each other. And one needs a sense of completion, that when you finish a paragraph, you have a certain set of ideas that are there and they're completed. And within the paragraph, you have sentences, and sentences also are telling a story, so that the compilation of sentences within a paragraph also tell a complete and coherent story. So I just want to say that this OCAR structure is not just appropriate for the paper. You can apply it to the sections, the paragraph, and the sentences. And I will end there, and I hope you could hear me okay. I hope to get lots of questions, and I really hope that this was useful to you as a starting point. Only. Usual waiting is here, and I will stop sharing as well so that we can actually see people as they ask questions or as you talk.
Okay, can you hear me, Tuyeni?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you so much for the wonderful and excellent presentation. And I appreciate everybody for taking the time even to listen to this presentation. This is excellent presentation, and I've really learned a lot. I really learned a lot, and from what Tuyeni presented, I just quickly make maybe one or two recap to remind us of what we have learned. So let me quickly look. Can I see my slide? Can I share my slide?
You should be able to.
Can we see my slide, please?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, so just a quick reminder of what we have learned, because I know quite a number of us joined while the presentation was going on. This is just a quick of what I've put together, just to recap what Tuyeni said before we take some question and answer. Quickly, she mentioned something like point to remember when you want to write. She told us that we need to read. Knowing about how to write is about reading. You can't know how to write without reading other publications. So we need to read. Number two, she has us to identify the style that speaks best to you, best to me. So if I want to know how to write, I must really know the style that speaks best to me. Now, we need to form a writing group. It's unfortunate that a number of us researchers are lone ranger. We don't work with others. So she has told us to form a writing group, a kind of group that can help us to read and correct our grammar. And next thing, we need to write. There's no way you can know how to write without writing. So you must write. Next one is, we need to get feedback from more experienced peers. If you know somebody who has been into publication for a while, please get to them to help you in reading your paper and make comments. Then get feedback to know how improving you are or how you need to improve yourself. Now, she said you should take critique of your work seriously. Critique of your writing seriously. When somebody make comments about your writing, please let's take it seriously when we are writing. Now, don't take perfect to be an enemy of good. Please, let's take note of that. And again, she told us that during writing, objective of publishing is getting cited. When your work is cited, you are recognized. Please let us look at the outlet that we publish our work, that we can be cited. Before we start writing, we must find important story of your data. This is what I just quickly jotted down. Then identify the key findings of your work before you start writing. When you want to write, please let us identify quickly what is that key findings in my study before I start publishing. And now, another thing, we should decide which data to present. A number of us, we have a lot of data that we want to present, a lot of data we want to write upon. But you have to decide, split your data and know the one that tells the story before you start writing. Now, she told us to develop visual aids that present our work or result effectively in terms of use of the figure, tables, and map. Now, she moved on to look at the OCAR, which is the OCAR. And she told us the O means opening. The opening is who or what is story all about. What is your paper all about? That is the opening. The challenge is the C, which is what question do you propose to answer? And then A is action. What happens to address the challenge? I mean, the question you pose. And resolution, what's your conclusion or the take-home lesson? Now, under our introduction, she tried to look at the opening, background, and the challenge. And then here, she told us the difference between literature review and introduction. This is where most of us make mistake. Try to differentiate between literature review and introduction, because she told us that literature review it forms a gap on what we already know. But introduction is about knowledge gap that you want to address. Now, materials and methods, she told us to move ahead with everything that the reader needs to know about what you do in order to replicate it. And that takes us to reproducibility of your methodology or method. Now, result is what you did before you start writing. So you have collected data already. Now, discussion is about presentation of your thoughts. Discussion is not just repeating your result again and again, but it's about presentation of your thoughts, interpretation of your data and results, answer your research questions, demonstrate how you answer those questions, and then identify most important results that you have presented. Now, in conclusion, it's about resolution. What is the take-home lesson? What do you think people need to know? What have you discovered? What is your major findings? And then you conclude with recommendation and conclusion. So thank you so much once again to Tuyeni for that excellent presentation. That is what I was able to jot down by following your presentation. So for now, let me quickly look at the two questions we have before we take those that have raised their hand. This is the first question by Abubakar Ringim. He said, apart from measuring the success of scientific paper via citation, are there other ways to measure this? For instance, the impact, understanding, and application of the research findings by non-scientists, especially local people, who in most cases do not even know how to read, use, interpret, or have access in general to the scientific paper. What is your experience about this? Can we look at this question to any response first?
Yes, and I won't only. We're 4 people on the panel. Lynn, Mark, please chip in whenever. So this presentation was just about writing scientific papers, no? And that means your audience is very clear. It's those who are reading scientific journals, which tends to be people in academia and research institutes. That's the community that you're trying to communicate with in a scientific paper. we are increasingly, as academics, as scientists, being asked to communicate to a wider audience, to communicate to the public, communicate to policymakers. Each one of those audiences requires a different communication approach, style, etc. And those are skills unto themselves. They're extremely important. I completely agree that they need and must be done, and we should consider it as part of our skill sets to be able to communicate to a wide variety of audience and to change the style depending on the audience. That's a whole nother topic. And in here, I only focused on communicating with peers, other scientists in your field.
So do we have any comment from Lynn, Baker, or Mark in trying to look at how do we communicate our research findings to those we consider as local people or those that are outside scientific platform? Is there any way, or do you have any experience to that, please? Can we take Mark or Lynn? Which one is going first, please?
Mark is still muted. I'll just mention, I think Tuyeni said it very well, you know, that part of our responsibility is to communicate to audiences outside the scientific community. So I agree with what Tuyeni has said there. And I don't really have anything to add at this point. I'll let Mark jump in.
Okay, Mark.
Oh, there I go. Now I can unmute myself. I wasn't able to unmute myself.
Oh,
yeah. But just speaking to the front end of that question, there's a lot of interest in trying to figure out what might be better metrics to think about the impact of a paper, particularly in conservation. We're really interested in how research that we produce and papers that we write get translated into action on the ground. And I must say we don't have a good alternative measure for this. And it's something that I think there's a lot of people thinking very hard about how we can get better metrics on the impact of our science, but it's not something that we've solved yet.
I think on my own part, recently there are different platforms that we can use to communicate our research findings, because not all the people that are scientists normally want to know the findings and application of our results. Now there are various outlets. Even we can use publications in dailies. We can maybe use a radio outlet. We can use even online newspapers to communicate our research findings in simple terms by which people can understand our results, not basically using our so-called jargons or big languages that we use in our scientific writing. But the only issue that I found in the question he has is measuring the impact. We know you as a scientist can measure your impact by looking at the rate of your citation, by looking at how many people that reference you, by looking at your H index, I index, and all those inserts on ResearchGate, on Google Scholar and all that. We can know our impact. But there are some impact we may not directly measure that we have already made with the local people. Maybe those are the area that we need to start looking into, not looking at non-scientific impact of our research finding. This is a very good area that I think we should start looking into. Now, let me quickly look at another question that was asked before. People, you can type in your question. I'll quickly go through and then I can read it to the presenter. Also, those people that want to raise hand, you can raise hand. Another question I have here is this. Sometimes results are mixed with discussions to gain time. Is it wrong to mix our discussion with results in order to gain time? I don't know. Do you understand the question, please?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it very much depends on how the journal you're writing in, what structure it might give you. So some journals want you to they have a results and discussion section, or they provide you the liberty to have your own structure in which case you can decide to put your results and discussion together, your results and interpretation of that and what it means. No, so there is no right or wrong. It just depends on what the journal might ask for, and the good thing about that is you can avoid the problem I mentioned earlier of repeating your results in the discussion. If you can discuss your results immediately, it's much less risk of repeating. The downside of that is your discussion becomes very sort of stepwise. You lose the opportunity to end in another kind of style. So I said you could end your discussion in many ways. You could start with saying, okay, here are my key findings, but your key findings could be a combination of different results. But if in your results section, you're sort of going step by step, answering each one of your questions. So you sort of limit how you structure your discussion. But there is no right and wrong. I certainly don't think so.
Okay, do we have anything from Lynn or Mark?
Mark, do you have anything? Oh, he's muted.
Okay, now.
I have one thing to add. Is that okay?
Okay, please.
Dr. Fola?
Okay.
Sorry, I just wanted to tie into that. Some of the things that when we've been reading some of the papers for the Nigerian NSCB conference coming up, one of the things that we noticed is that in many cases, results are being discussed in the results section, and the discussion sort of repeats a lot of the results without really going and tying into those key findings and talking about the significance of what your study is, what makes this meaningful, or what did you find? So I think to be careful with that, especially when you have the paper actually wants a results section and a discussion section distinctly. When you have those distinct sections, be careful not to be, discussing all your this is significant because in the results section. Save that for the discussion. Make sure you highlight your key findings and talk about the significance in the context of other studies and what we know about that area. So I just want to point that out. Thank you.
Oh,
yeah, for my part, I would say that those were both very good answers. I think as we move along, there's more variety in the structure of papers in the scientific literature, and that is good. There's lots of perspectives and short communication pieces where that structure of introduction, methods, results, discussion breaks down a little bit. But I think that it's a really, as Tuyeni pointed out really well, it's a really helpful structure of the way to think about the paper to communicate everything well. And I agree that confusing and confounding results and discussion when you actually have a results and a discussion section can be a really annoying way to read a paper. And so thinking about those things distinctively as achieving distinct goals is a really good practice in terms of writing.
Oh, thank you so much for the information too. I think from the way over the years I've been reviewing papers for a number of journals that I've been editor, I found out that people find it a very easy way out by trying to merge their results with discussion. And with this, they try to find an escape to quickly round up a paper and just send it out to any journal or publications of their choice. But you do more work, you do more elaboration or interesting work in your paper by separating your results from your discussion. Although this is subject to some outlets, because I quite agree that some journal may want you to match your discussion with your result, but many journals will actually ask that you separate your results from your discussion. If you separate your result from your discussion, you do a whole lot of work by explaining your result properly and then bringing out the message you want to convey, and then expanding the scope by citing other work, other existing or previous work to back up your finding. So to the young guys who are trying to write paper out there that we are targeting, I want you to do yourself a good by separating your results from your discussion. Let your result section just present what you have in your graph, in your tables, in your map. And then when you get to discussion, you now try to explain, interpret what those things are saying in your own thoughts, and then by backing it up with your other references. So thank you for that. Let me quickly take this question again. I hope we are far above our 4:30, but because of technical challenges, we lost some time. So please let us just take time to look at one or two questions again. I want us to look at this question. It's very interesting, and it's for the beginner. The question says, what about tips on which section to start with when you are a beginner in writing scientific paper? Where do you start? Do you start by writing the introduction, then your methodology, or then your result, conclusion, blah? Or there is a way we can write and then merge at the end? Who is going